and Pepco, which is the local distribution utility company. But it's kind of an indicator of a lot of the things that are going on out in the larger world. So as a bit of background, I work at a place called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, a small nonprofit based in Minneapolis, where I head up our energy program, and our focus is largely on how local economies can prosper from the transformation to renewable energy. So how do we make it so it's not just big utility companies building wind farms and solar arrays, but how can communities have a role in the decision-making about how the new energy economy looks, and also how can they secure some of the economic benefits. So I'm always impressed talking to college classes about this issue, because when I was in college, we didn't have anything about renewable energy. And in fact, before I took this position 9 years ago now, I only had one class on energy in graduate school in order to give me any kind of background in this. So I'm always impressed to see how many of you there are studying this. At least I assume there are many of you, since I'm facing the other direction right now. But in terms of what's happening in the utility system, or in the electricity system and the transformation, is that we have right now a lot of friction between the rules that we have for our energy system and the technology that's available and the economic opportunities that are available. And a perfect example is kind of like what happened in the cell phone industry and the phone industry 10 years ago. Almost everybody has a smartphone these days, and they're rather ubiquitous. And 10 years ago, the landline phone companies were saying, oh, this is not that big a deal. Not everybody's going to go do cell phones. People are always going to want a landline or whatnot. And so they were totally unprepared for what happened. And the result is that when you got your smartphone, chances are you didn't buy it from your landline phone company. They were not providing it to you. You bought it from some third party. And maybe even that cellular device company that you subscribe to isn't owned by the landline phone company. Although, of course, as big companies often do, they have moved back in, and now AT&T, which was the landline phone giant, is one of the big mobile companies. So they do find ways around this innovation problem for themselves in the long run. But at any rate, the rules weren't really set up for them to accommodate this, and so the companies that are still in the landline phone business are shrinking. And of course, cell phones are allowing people to do many more things than make phone calls. I mean, there were jokes when one of the iPhones came out and there was a problem with the way that you held it affecting the antenna, and Apple basically saying, well, you're holding it the wrong way, and who cares anyway, because nobody's making voice calls anymore. It's these phones can do so much more, they're pocket computers. And that really is the same thing happening in the electricity industry. A perfect example, my mom, who's 67 years old, can use her smartphone to change the temperature in her house on her thermostat. She can operate the little wires on her roof that will melt the snow and prevent ice dams. And she's capable of doing this because the smartphone makes it accessible and makes it easy. And this is what utility companies that first developed 80 to 100 years ago around a centralized command and control kind of system, big power plants and big power lines delivering power to big cities, but all in a one-way direction, and customers who were essentially dumb takers of that power. And so they're totally unprepared for this, and in some ways they're not really to blame, because we said back in those days, in order to build a really big power plant, you needed a lot of money, and if we were going to concentrate that kind of capital, we were going to need to give them a monopoly. And monopolies, culturally and economically, do not innovate very often because they have no incentive to do so. And so that is why we are where we're at, is that, much like with cellular phones and smartphones, that were things the landline phone companies couldn't have envisioned or didn't bother to because of their secure position, electric companies are now seeing threats to their financial well-being from the fact that energy efficiency is essentially flattening energy sales. Electricity sales peaked in 2007 and have not risen since nationwide. And so for most electric companies, that source of revenue has quickly dried up in terms of growing sales. But also distributed generation, like solar power on rooftops or wind power owned by farmers and put on their property, is cutting into their energy sales as well. From that standpoint, and also reducing the need to build new power plants, which is the other key source of revenue. So a monopoly utility company would make money in two ways. They would make money from energy sales, which generally always rose, but they would really make money for their shareholders whenever they spent money on new infrastructure, building new power plants and new power lines. And so this new era in which customers have unprecedented control over their energy use, whether that's by generating their own power or using their smartphone, is a really serious financial threat to them under the business model that they have. And the problem is that the regulations don't always keep up. The regulations have sort of put them in a straitjacket, whereas they might, even the very few, I think, that are culturally prepared to adapt are not able to, because they can't make money necessarily selling services outside of what they're typically used to doing, which is building infrastructure. So we have this very interesting point of tension. And I mentioned when we were just getting set up that I just did this interview with some folks out in Washington, D.C., who are dealing with this merger between Exelon, a very large utility company here in the Midwest, and then kind of the mid-Atlantic states, and Pepco, which is the for-profit utility company that has a monopoly service territory for the District of Columbia. And it's a classic case of how these big companies try to solve this financial problem, which is Exelon has, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, made a really big bet that as the wholesale markets became more competitive, the place where big power plants compete to sell energy to the smaller distribution utilities that bring it on the poles and wires to your homes, that was going to be really profitable for them, and that nuclear power plants were the way to go. And unfortunately, they made those were very bad bets. Cheap natural gas has undercut them, cheap wind power has undercut them, and so now they're looking at mergers and acquisitions as a way to diversify their revenue stream, and there's nothing better than a distribution utility like Pepco that has a captive audience. They have a monopoly. There's no competition, and they would be free to raise rates as much as they wanted to. Or as much as they can get through the Public Service Commission, at least. So I guess that's kind of the landscape that we're in, and my work in particular looks at ways that we change the rules to give customers more control over that energy future, rather than figuring out a way to change a culturally and economically unsuited monopoly company that is really very resistant to change. And so figuring out ways that customers can take advantage of smartphones and Wi-Fi controllable appliances and all these kind of things to control their energy use. So I have a few large electricity consuming devices in my residence, a washer, a dryer, a refrigerator, a dishwasher. I could change when I use that energy for the most part, just like people are charging electric cars at night when energy demand is relatively low and often given a discount by the utility for doing that. Can we find other ways to price the things that we want in the market in terms of energy use, so that instead of everybody using energy all at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on that hot, sunny summer day, which is what we end up building the system for, and building very many more power plants than we need on an average basis in order to serve that one time, how can we use the system more efficiently? How can we look to customers to solve those issues of how we use that system efficiently? And then how can customers economically benefit? So how can they make money because their electric car can provide what's called frequency regulation or other services like that to the grid. It can provide backup power to the grid in the same way that it takes the electricity. How can customers sell solar energy from their rooftop to the grid system when they're not using it? And offset the need for other large power plant investments. So there's a lot of opportunities out there right now from the technology standpoint, but the rules are being written as we speak. And some states like New York and California are kind of at the very edge of those rules, or Hawaii, where as many as 15% of homeowners have solar on their rooftops. And then states like ours, Iowa or Minnesota or others in the Midwest, are at a point where we know the technology is going to come and the transformation will happen even faster for us because it will have been tested out in other places first. But we have to have the rules in place by the time that it gets here. Otherwise, we're likely to be in a situation where either the utility company is going to go bankrupt or they're going to raise rates ridiculously high to cover the fewer and fewer customers that they have available on the system, and what some are calling the death spiral of electric utility companies. So it's a fascinating time to be studying these energy issues from a political and an economic standpoint, and there's a lot of opportunity for change. I don't think I have anything further to say in terms of an introduction, but I do love doing questions and answers, so I think I'll leave it for that.
Everybody move up to the front. Hey, John, really excellent. I'm going to have everybody kind of move up to the front, and I'm going to take your the computer, and I'm going to turn around so you can see everybody and have more of a conversation. Is that okay? Whoops, he can't hear me. Okay. Hey, John, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to take the computer and turn it around so that you can see the students and maybe have more of a conversation. So hang on just a second here. It's just going to take me a minute to reorganize. Let's see how this works. Whoops. What did I just pull out? Okay. Okay.
Watch your hip.
You guys see him? Okay there? John, can you see people?
I can, thank you.
Whoops, how's that? Better?
Yes, even better.
Okay. So just to give you a little context of what we are here, this is Maharishi University of Management. I've met you once or twice, you may not remember. I met you at up at Luther College at a when there was a
Oh yeah.
An event for Upper Midwest sustainability.
Campus sustainability folks, yes.
Yeah, and they were honoring your dad there. Yeah, and anyway, this is what you're looking at. If you look around this room here a little bit, this is the new Sustainable Living Center. It generates 40% more energy than it consumes. It produces all its own water for water supply from rainwater. The building's made of rammed earth blocks that students helped build, it's a good example of some of these kind of innovations put into place so that this place is kind of like a living laboratory for what we're teaching in our program. In our program, what we're trying to do is train students to have the skills to help design, build, and maintain sustainable communities. Basically, rethinking everything that humans do in terms of sustainability. And I think that's a lot of what you guys do at Institute for Local Self-Reliance as well.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, a lot of what we focus on is how do we change the rules to make it easier for people to do those things. So maybe something that would touch a little closer to home would be that most states allow cities or set like a building energy code, so a minimum level of energy efficiency required in a dwelling or a commercial building. And in some states, they'll allow cities to go further than the state code, what they sometimes call a stretch energy code. And so we're always interested in getting policies passed that make it easier for communities to go further and to not be held back by state or federal rules, but also things that encourage that kind of activity.
So, you guys have any questions for? Yeah, you got a question?
Do you know much about the policy for renewable energy technology in Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania, good question. I'm actually talking with some people next week from Philadelphia, where the new administration, as I understand it, is very interested in figuring out some ways to encourage clean energy and energy efficiency through city-based policy. I guess what I would say is, as I understand it, the state has like a renewable portfolio standard. So there's a statewide law that says that the utility companies need to get a certain amount of their energy from renewables. There is what's called virtual net metering, which is sort of a weird name for a policy, but most of the solar power that's built on homes and businesses in this country uses what's called net metering, which essentially says that your meter will spin forward when you are using electricity, and then it will spin backward when you are feeding electricity into the grid if you're producing it from solar, and then you pay the net amount, which is why they call it net metering, at the end of that month. And sometimes there is a carryover then between different months. But without getting into the weeds, most of those policies require that solar is on your property. A virtual net metering means that you could have that solar array on a church or a school, for example, and that people could share portions of that solar array and still use it to net against their electricity consumption. So that's one of the things I'm talking to folks about in Pennsylvania is there is that law in the books which would allow the city, for example, to put solar arrays maybe on properties that are not city property but still reduce energy consumption and energy use and energy bills for the city, which is very exciting. Anytime a municipality can do that, it's great because it means there are more tax dollars for things that people care about, whether it's police or schools or libraries. So I mean that's just a little slice. Without going into a lot of detail, there's a great website called the Database of State Incentives for Renewable Energy, DSIRE, and they catalog for every state kind of everything that's available, and I highly recommend that site.
Go ahead. Anybody else have a question?
I've seen posts about some states, like I think Florida is one of them, passing laws that you can't it's illegal to go off grid. You know, there's places that are saying you can't disconnect from, you know, you can't generate all your own power. How can they get away with that?
That's a great question. You know, we did a little video recently about the largest utility company in Florida. It's called Florida Power and Light. They're actually one of the largest utility companies in the country, and they were interested in taking over the utility company in Hawaii. And so we did this video from that perspective of, it was kind of what we called a postcard from Florida to let folks in Hawaii know, like, this is what that utility company is like. And you know, they have, I think between Florida Power and Light and the other utilities, they have one lobbyist for every 2 legislators. So when you ask how can they do that, that is how they do that, kind of from a practical standpoint. Usually the rules aren't about being sort of off the grid. I mean, it's generally very cost prohibitive unless you have kind of a cabin in the woods where it would be expensive to string the poles and wires to be off the grid. Usually the electricity that we get from the grid is more reliable and less expensive than something that you could do from an off-the-grid system. That's starting to not be the case, and in the coming years, especially as energy storage, like batteries, gets very cheap, that won't be the case as much. And so what's happening instead is that utilities are usually looking for ways to reduce the ability of folks to do solar or to do battery storage. So for example, in Arizona, the utility companies are putting additional fees on the electric bills of customers who have solar. And the argument that they're making is that, well, we need the backup power. You know, these things don't produce energy all the time. But it's a really ridiculous argument, unfortunately. It's sad that the energy system regulators will accept it because, this is just one of my illustrations of this. So a hairdryer is something that most people have, or most households have. A hairdryer uses 1,800 watts or 1.8 kilowatts of electricity when it's turned on, which is about a third the size of a solar panel. We don't have to pay a tax to have a hairdryer. We can just turn it on and off. So the system is resilient to a lot of fluctuation already. And so the notion that we need to tax one particular person who puts solar on this system is ridiculous because we have lots of variability in energy use that the system is already designed to accommodate. Now, in the aggregate, when, say, 10 or 15 or 20% of all households have a solar panel, it will start to make a material difference in how you operate the grid and change the way that you need to do that and maybe require some money and infrastructure to do that. But we're not near that point in any state except Hawaii. And so, unfortunately, it is a ploy by the utility companies to make it less economically attractive to go solar. And the problem that they're going to run into, of course, is that it'll work in the short run. But then getting back to what you said about people sort of defecting from the grid and disconnecting, at some point it will actually be more economic to do that, especially if it becomes more and more expensive to stay on the grid. And that is what's generally happening, is that electric rates are rising very quickly and utility companies are making it more expensive very fast, in part because they're making poor decisions about where to invest that money. So it's a tricky problem, and it's, like I said before, utility companies are making dumb decisions, and it's sometimes because the incentives for them are to make dumb decisions, that we need to change the rules to make them make good decisions.
John, you had said before, you work a lot with cities because it seems like that in the past there's been somewhat of a leadership vacuum in this area at the federal and state level, and a lot of the innovation has come from cities. Do you see that changing these days?
No, I mean, I think the federal government is likely to have a minimal impact on where things, on where the innovation is going to happen. There are a few big decisions that they face, such as the extension of the solar tax credit, which is set to expire at the end of 2016. And whatever Congress decides to do will have a very material impact on the development of solar. The only other place that the federal government can really have much of an impact is that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is sort of the governing body for the big transmission system. So when you drive down the highway and there's those really tall steel poles with the multiple wires on them that carry power over long distances, that's regulated at the federal level. And so, again, there are issues with the rules there in terms of, let's say you needed, the equivalent of a new power plant's of capacity for the city of Chicago. There are arguably many ways you could do this. You could build a new gas-fired power plant and some transmission lines that would bring the power into the urban area. You could install a lot of rooftop solar and battery storage and things like that and meet the same demand. And the problem is that when we make decisions at the federal level about transmission lines, we're not actually allowed to consider, in many cases, what a local solution might look like, or to weigh the economics of those two in that same venue. And so we have this sort of disconnect in our decision-making process that's very challenging, which is why we generally look to localize decision-making as much as possible so that we don't get stuck in this place where, you know, the federal regulators are making decisions sort of in a vacuum, and when there's a lot of evidence that those local solutions will actually be less expensive. So anyway, to get back to the question though, so the federal government is not really a place that we look to for a lot of innovation. States have really been the policy laboratories, and then there's been a lot of really interesting stuff happening in cities too that that I try to write about in particular.
Question, Steve, question? Anybody else?
Do you know of any really innovative local hydroelectric power stations? Or like small scale utility with the hydro?
The short answer is no. I know there are some new developments with hydro. In fact, there's an effort right now to revive an old hydro system on the Mississippi River that runs through downtown Minneapolis. We haven't seen a lot of that. I think partly it's that the tax incentives are really focused on wind and solar, and so that's where we've seen the development. But also because, you know, wind and solar are sort of what I like to call modular, which is, you know, the solar array that's on my house is just one panel, one of the same kind of panel that you would do in a utility scale system of 10,000 panels. And the way that you install them is essentially the same. So there are a lot of economies to capture in that. Even with wind power, it's similar because a wind power plant is usually lots of individual turbines, even though they're very big. I mean, they're each the height of a football field or more, and I'm sure living in Iowa that you've seen any number of them. But with the other technologies, like, you know, some people ask me about biogas, for example, and digesters or hydro, there's a lot more kind of specific issues either with the material that you collect for the digester or the particular geographic orientation that you have with the hydro that have really slowed the development. So it's not something I've really kept track of, although I know that there's some things out there, I don't know about them.
Go ahead, question over here.
You mentioned like the video you made, the postcard from Florida to Hawaii, and it sounds like you guys do a lot of work writing new policies and trying to implement new rules that support renewable energy. What other things do you do to prevent the policies from utility companies that harm the likelihood of solar and renewable energy being implemented? Is there a way
Sure.
that you can...
Good question. So, you know, we're a small group. In fact, until about 2 months ago, I was the only full-time staff person that did our energy work, although we've been able to hire some more help, which is terrific. So what I've done in the past is usually we will provide kind of like policy and economic analysis. So for example, in 2013, we wrote a report on what's called the value of solar, and we also helped to write a policy in Minnesota that passed the legislature called the value of solar tariff. And what it essentially did is it required the utility company to go out and calculate based on basically the value of energy that came from solar relative to the energy that it would offset. So, you know, if I get a megawatt solar array on the rooftop of an IKEA store or a Walmart, how much would that energy be worth based on the fact that it, you know, reduces the purchases of dirty energy, so that it therefore acts as a hedge against fossil fuel prices that go up and down, but we know that the cost of solar energy will be constant and zero, that it will potentially reduce it will reduce wear and tear on the distribution electric grid because you'll have power that's produced locally that will often offset energy consumption at the times of peak use. So there are a lot of different ways in which solar provides value to the grid, and utility companies traditionally have not been willing to put a number on that because it's not the way they made money. And so the value of solar policy was one way to require them to do that. And so we helped pass that in Minnesota, and we wrote a report about it that then we've supplied to other national advocates that work on these issues. So for example, in Arizona or New Mexico or California, And when they're going to file their comments with the regulators about why these taxes and fees on solar are a lousy idea, they might cite our work, or we might sign on to comments to kind of lend our weight and expertise to them, or we might work with them in drafting those comments. So there are a lot of different ways that we will do that work, sort of through the formal process. And then sometimes we like to do these sort of sillier things. So if you look up the video that we did, the Postcards from Florida video, you know, it was just we found a music video that was sort of entertaining with a, you know, the song name was Postcards, and it had this hilarious image of these folks on a hovercraft going through the Everglades in Hawaiian shirts. And we just overlaid that with some text kind of saying, like, you know, Florida Power and Light has all these lobbyists. They've overcharged their customers. They've opposed the addition of solar policies. Why would you want them to be your utility in Hawaii? They're lousy. Yeah. So, and we had some allies in Hawaii that we were working with, and they made sure that that video was seen by, you know, several thousand people and got to the utility commissioners and whatnot. And while it might not be filed as formal comments, you know, a utility commissioner can't unsee that video and can't, you know, take back the fact that they've learned a little something from a particular perspective. And so, you know, we try to be to have some influence that way as well.
Okay. Any other comments? John's been really generously. I got a couple questions for you, John. You know, I was around when there was the phone company deregulation in 1984. And I actually ran a small telephone company then, and a lot of these same arguments, I think you've made this point in some of your writings, a lot of the same arguments that were there about the deregulation of the phone company then, and stranded investment are here now. And so one of the things that was, one of the things that had to be addressed in that was the rural telephone companies who were getting some support you know, from the artificially high prices of long distance service, and so there was a fund that was set up to kind of cover those costs, and that kind of you know, helped solve that problem. Where do you see this kind of stranded investment argument? What's your counter to that these days? What's your solution or counter to the stranded investment argument?
It's a great question. So, you know, the issue obviously is that you have a lot of utility companies that have built big power lines, new gas power plants, maybe even new coal power plants in the past couple of decades. They're not paid off yet, or maybe they are paid off, but they are still economically viable, at least the way that we price energy without including environmental costs. And so the utility company will argue, well, you can't make us change the way that we're doing things or shut down these coal power plants because we can't afford to. You know, we are still spending money on them. And there are a few different answers to that. In some cases, I've seen examples of utilities saying, even though our old contract for dirty power is still in force, that we can sign a new contract for clean energy and pay off the old one and still have it be cheaper. So there are going to be instances where the economics are simply that favorable. I think that one can make an argument that investments made very recently in the past decade were stupid, yeah. and that in the case of for-profit companies, that the shareholders should eat that decision because the writing was on the wall that this shift to renewables was coming. There were a lot of policies already in place across, you know, the 25 or 30 states that have state renewable standards. So making investments in coal power plants was a bad idea, and they ought to have known that. I would love to see us, in fact, have rules that we pass at a state level, essentially making that argument, that utilities that build new fossil fuel infrastructure will be on the hook for those as stranded investments. You know, the liability lies with them and not with ratepayers in the future, because, and that will make them unfinanceable. So there's sort of a way to use what's happened and look forward. I think, however, there is still an issue, and that kind of fund idea to help out is an important one because, and it's funny that you mentioned rural, because rural electric cooperatives are in fact in more of a pickle than almost any other utility companies.
Except for Warren McKenna.
Right. Although the reason he's not in a pickle is, as I understand it, he has a much less reliance on long-term right. all purchase contracts. Right. I don't know how much we want to get into the weeds about how this works, but most rural electric cooperatives, you know, started in the 1930s because nobody else wanted to bring them electric service. And so the farmers and other rural residents banded together, pooled their money, started a cooperative and started stringing wires with the help of the federal government under what was called the Rural Utility Service. This history, by the way, will be relatively short, but it's very important. So what happened over time was that at first there were lots of really tiny utility companies that had strung the wires, and they realized, well, in order to build the power plants at an economically efficient scale, we're going to need to pool our resources. And so your co-ops often banded together. So for example, in Minnesota, Great River Energy is a co-op of co-ops. It is a large power plant owning, transmission line building company that is owned wholly by about 44, I think, smaller distribution cooperatives. Now, Great River Energy then invested in a whole bunch of power plant infrastructure over many years, including a lot of coal power plants. They also sometimes owned coal mines and other fossil fuel infrastructure. And so the problem is that you don't have a for-profit company here to blame for bad decision making. All of the distribution co-ops, the local co-ops, have signed sometimes 50 or even 99-year contracts to buy the power for these power plants, so that even after they're paid off, they're really still obligated to buy the electricity from them. And the larger co-ops are essentially stuck because that's where all their revenue comes from. And sometimes they even own the coal power or the coal mine that's selling the coal to the coal power plant. So the best argument I've heard is essentially a kind of bailout where you say to the rural co-ops, if you build renewables like wind and solar, we will give you kind of a one-to-one credit against your debt with the federal government, because most of these power plants and whatever were built using federal loans through the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Rural Utility Service. So there's an opportunity there, I think, to say essentially, if you go out and do the right thing, then we will use taxpayer money to help pay off these bad investments so that we can retire them in the public interest. That's the best idea I've heard so far, frankly. But it probably is going to be in the nature of what happened with the phone service in terms of helping to prop up some of the rural areas where the decisions were particularly bad relative to where we are now, and there's not a lot of flexibility to move around it.
Another question. I was talking to the public advocate for the Public Utilities Commission here in Iowa, and I was kind of struck by, the tone of the conversation was that solar is bad for poor people. And their argument was that, well, as more and more, sort of middle class and wealthier people put solar panels on their house using tax credits and all this, then the fixed costs of the grid are going to be more and more borne by lower income people. And it's part of this. I think there's a kind of national campaign to spread this idea that solar is bad for poor people. And so how do you address that?
Well, the first thing I do is say, why should a utility company be the spokesperson for poor people? They've never given a shit. The poor people get assistance to pay their bills from usually some sort of ratepayer fund that was imposed on the utilities by state law or federal law. So the idea that they speak for poor people is crazy. The second issue I have with it is, the implication from that is solar's for rich people, therefore we need to do something about that on behalf of poor people. Well, you could find a way to let poor people buy into solar. The problem here is one that is common to a lot of things in American life, which is that if you don't have a bunch of money that you're sitting on, it's hard to buy into things. So like a Tesla and electric vehicles, for example, are also not much for poor people. Smartphones didn't used to be for poor people, but that's been changing, in part because the cost comes down over time and makes it more accessible. And then but the more important thing is that there become available ways to finance things so that it's accessible to everybody. So, you can get a car loan. Your phone company often subsidized the cost of your smartphone device, and you could buy a phone on contract that was accessible to a lot of people. But the utility companies are in a particularly good place to offer people a chance to buy in, because they can use the utility bill to allow people to pay back investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy. They can also do that without having to have the same kind of credit requirements that a bank might. So instead of saying, oh, for folks who have a credit score of 650 or 700 or better, which is relatively high, we can simply base whether or not we'll allow people to finance this stuff on whether or not they pay their utility bill. And most people pay their utility bill. So, and even low-income folks. So there's lots, and the utility company could say essentially, if you invest in a whole bunch of energy efficiency stuff that will pay back in 10 years or less, we will finance that for you over 10 years. such that your monthly payment to us is less than the amount of money that you have saving on the basis of those energy improvements. And that you could probably roll solar into that. In Minnesota, we have now a community solar law that allows people to subscribe to solar arrays that are not on their property, and it can be a slice of their energy use up to their entire energy bill. We could finance that on the electric bill. So there are lots of ways that utility companies could help poor people, and screwing with solar isn't one of them.
Yeah. And what about that argument of this kind of stranded investment, a variation of the stranded investment argument that says as more and more people use solar, there's going to be, and as you do things like community solar, where you change the the ability to people to aggregate, for example, their demand,
yeah.
And things like that, that you change those kind of structures that are there, that there's going to be fewer and fewer people around to pay the fixed cost of the utility. What's your? I don't think it's a valid argument, so I'm not arguing for it. But
No.
I'd just like to hear your.
Yeah. So let me just give an illustration. So let's say that you wanted to buy the computer that's up here. You could offer a price for it, like $300, or somebody might say to you, I've got a couple of iPhones that I'd like to trade you for it. Now, if somebody offered you the iPhones, you wouldn't tell them that's not something of value because you didn't give me money. It is something of value, and you can both recognize the value. Now, the problem that we have with solar right now is that the utility company is saying essentially is when people aren't buying power from us, then they're not giving us something of value. And my argument would be they're putting solar energy onto the grid. They're supplying power to the grid system, and that's something of value. And that's that whole paper that I wrote and the policy that we passed in Minnesota called The Value of Solar, is that it's sort of like we're, at this moment, sort of back to the barter economy. Like, I give you a little bit of solar, and you give me some credit on my bill. I mean, there's a transaction going on, and what's happening right now is utility companies are essentially pretending like it has no value, that it's simply reducing their energy sales, because that's the way they've always accounted for it, because their accounting system was very limited in terms of its scope. I mean, we're talking very simplistic. A great anecdote is, net metering came about because some guy connected a solar array without permission to the grid system back in the 1970s, and they realized that the meter would turn backwards when he did that. And the utility company looked at that and said, oh, well then maybe we could have a net metering policy. And it couldn't be any more sophisticated than that, because the only thing the meter could do was either spin forward or spin backwards. Right. So that's why we have net metering. Yeah. I mean, 45 states use that as the primary policy to compensate people who provide power from distributed solar. It's the nature of the technology. And that will change as the technology changes. But anyway, I mean, to get back to that though, so something of value is being put into the grid that's not being recognized. And so this notion that there are going to be fixed costs or the cost of the grid won't be paid for, it's like, no, they're just being paid for in a different way. Right. And what that's going to do for you is that there will be other costs that are not going to have to be paid for anymore. The new power plants, the new power lines, the system upgrades, whatever, the wholesale market purchases that you had to make will not have to be made because of the solar available on the system. Now, there will be some other costs that might be associated with the system, and this gets into another issue where utilities are raising the sort of fixed charge portion of the bill. So right now, an electric bill has two pieces. There's the part that you pay whether or not you use any energy every month, which is usually very low, like $5 or $10. And then there's the amount that you pay based on how much you use. And what utilities companies are saying is essentially, well, a lot of this stuff doesn't change for us from month to month. The cost of employees, the cost of maintaining the grid. So more of the bill should be a fixed charge. And we offer as a counterexample, myself and many other people, think about like a coffee store chain like Starbucks. They have lots of physical locations that don't change, and electric bills, and equipment, and all that stuff, and employee salaries that don't change. Do you have a cover charge when you go into Starbucks? Do you pay $5 to get in the door, and then you can buy some coffee? No. Fixed charges have nothing to do with fixed prices. You can structure how you recover your revenue in any way you want. And for Starbucks, it's charging $4.25 for a cup of coffee. And for a utility company, it can be something else. And it's especially important because the utility method here of fixed charges completely undermines any economic incentive for them to behave wisely in terms of spending that money, because they can now go out and build new power plants willy-nilly, and they will recover all that cost through the fixed charge. It means that customers who use lots of energy will pay less. Customers that use hardly any energy will pay more. There's no conservation incentive any longer. So it's terrible, terrible policy. And that's the issue that we're facing with utilities right now is, you know, number one, they're asking for things that are absolutely economically stupid. And number two, they're kind of doing that in part because the rules that we set up for them, you know, 5 decades ago are really outdated and need to be updated. And the problem that we're in right now, and the real question we're wrestling with is it still wise to have a monopoly utility company, period, that we should rewrite the rules for? Or should we be talking about an entirely different system in which, you know, maybe like the roads where FedEx and UPS and the Postal Service all compete to offer services, we need a grid that's like that, that's open and fair and transparent.
Yeah. So from your perspective, if you had a clean slate, if you could go in and you were made the, you know, Public Utility Commissioner, czar of Minnesota or any state, what would your ideal policy to move us forward in the future? How would you restructure utilities? I know it's a big question, but could you kind of just give us a quick outline of the dream scenario?
Sure. Well, I'll do my best anyway. It's probably a good wrap-up question for me too. I do have another conversation here coming up. But I think where I'm looking right now as what I think is a pretty good model is actually what's happening in New York. They're calling it reforming the energy vision. And the idea is essentially what I just outlined with the roads, which is can you have former FERC Commissioner John Wellinghoff calls it grid neutrality. So in the same way that we were talking about the internet being neutral toward the provider, that people would not be charged special fees to access special things, that we'd have an electric grid that would operate in the same way, so that the utility company would become a sort of a platform provider for lots of market participants to come in and offer services. And so, you know, instead of buying electricity from the utility company, I could buy it from lots of different people. I could buy that bundled with energy efficiency services, or bundled with storage, or bundled with solar on my roof, or bundled with a community solar subscription. I could use my electric vehicle to, you know, charge at nighttime so it was cheap, but then provide some services to the utility grid during the day. That when we did distribution system planning, so when that platform provider came in and said, hey, our grid needs some capacity in this particular place, it wouldn't simply be a conversation of, hey, we want to build a substation for $50 million or $500 million. Regulator, will you approve that? It would instead be we need X much capacity in this geographic region. Let's put it out for bid and see what we can get. There's an example of this actually. Con Edison in New York did a similar thing. They had $1 billion substation that they wanted to do. And the Public Service Commission said, no, we want you to go find other ways to do it. And I think they found something that was at least half as much, if not cheaper, with a combination of distributed solar and storage and whatnot. So again, you know, more of a market, frankly. But I think the second piece of it that's really important, this gets back to like the consumer advocate problem of these folks who see where we're going as a real threat to the low-income ratepayer and whatnot, is how can everybody participate in a way that protects them from manipulation? And so, you know, my example of this is like if you've ever worked somewhere where you had a 401k option and you got to pick kind of how you would invest that money, you probably could have picked every individual stock that was in your portfolio, but you probably didn't. What you probably did was picked between the aggressive, the moderately aggressive, the moderate, and the conservative portfolio. And that's kind of how we need to structure our electricity bills for people, is to say for someone on a fixed income, they're going to want the conservative option, which is maybe a fixed rate all day long for their electricity purchases, maybe, you know, combined with some kind of conservation thing that helps them save money. But something they don't have to manage a lot themselves, and something that is going to give them consistent knowledge of how much it's going to cost from month to month. And then for energy nerds like myself, there's an aggressive portfolio where I can have lots of little gadgets in my house to manage when my dishwasher runs and when my electric vehicle puts power into the system when I get an electric car. You know, when my solar panel would feed into the grid when I get a solar panel, all those kind of things. So that the system would be, I like to call it sophisticated simplicity, that we would have a very sophisticated market with very good rules that were transparent and non-discriminatory, but that we would make it simple for people to participate by giving them these kind of portfolio options. I think that's where we are probably headed, at least in a few states. It frankly seems to me to be the only rational way to go, because it's the idea that we would still have a utility company. I mean, I have one last analogy to offer you, I think, about kind of where we are with the utilities, is imagine the utility company as a juggler. And 50 years ago, the number of balls that they had to juggle was very limited because it was essentially the power plants that they owned and controlled in their service territory. And the grid now, with people having all sorts of phone controlled devices and solar panels and whatever, the crowd in front of that juggler now all has a ball, and they're all starting to throw it at the juggler at the same time. That one person can't keep all those balls in play at the same time. We need a system of rules rather than one ruler over that whole system. And so we're gonna move in that direction no matter what. And it may be that the vision that I have is what happens, or something somewhere in between.
Hey, thanks a lot, John. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you seem to be really blowing. Just a few years ago, utilities were saying, "Oh, we'll never have more than a very small percent, maybe 5 or 10% renewables on grids because of the variability." But we're just blowing past that all over the world now. And the 100% renewable energy grid is rapidly becoming a reality much faster than I ever imagined. So thanks a lot to people like you who are on the forefront of making the policy work for it. Thank you.
Sure, and thanks to all of you who want to get into this business. I can't wait to see what your contributions will be.
Thanks, John. Take care.
Yep, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. What'd you think?
Very, very cool.
Interesting guy, huh?
Yeah.
And